If your sleep sucks, then everything else sucks. Okay, it changes your mood, it changes your perception of things, it changes your mental motor. So let's go ahead and look at how this works. Quick, pragmatic, tangible, somewhat rapid fire things that you can do as a complete guide to improving sleep. We have to have an understanding of sort of the embryonic education of sleep stages first, so this all makes sense. Okay, you have 4 stages of sleep. 3 that are non-REM, 1 that is REM. Stage 1 is when you fall asleep on the couch and you kind of nod in and out and you swear up and down that you weren't asleep, but you were. Okay, that's the best way to describe it. Not a lot happening there. Then when we move into stage 2, this N2, this is where your body temperature starts to drop, things start to change, you start to get into these sleep patterns, you start to go through what are called sleep spindles, where you're having periods of slow wave sleep, so some memory consolidation. Again, it's not the one that's focused on the most, however, it's pretty important. Then we move into stage 3, which is the deep sleep. This is what's happening when it comes down to things like muscle repair. Okay, this is deep cell regeneration, kind of the rejuvenation process for the physical body, really. Then you move into REM. Okay, REM is where your brain is almost as active as it would be during the day, but your body is immobilized. Muscles are immobilized, so you don't start literally acting out your dreams and weird stuff like that, right? So you have a lot of memory consolidation. They all have different benefits within each stage. And each time we disrupt this stage, we have a different issue that comes to be. If you disrupt REM, you disrupt memory. If you disrupt deep sleep, you disrupt muscle recovery and repair. So it's all important. There was an interesting study that found that motor performance, cognitive performance, and mood were all affected by even mild sleep impairment, with mood being the most affected. The reason that I say this as an important point is because if your mood is affected, everything is affected. If you go into a workout with a crappy mood, you're gonna have a crappy workout. It's a trickle-down effect. So the mood really is everything. So have you ever noticed, oh, maybe I just was grumpy yesterday because I had a cruddy night of sleep. So getting into how we correct this kind of thing, because dealing with sleep issues is one of the most frustrating things. You feel out of control, you feel like you can't do anything about it, and sometimes you stress yourself out with these little sleep hygiene tactics to the point where you actually end up stressed before bed and then you don't sleep at all, okay? Some of the biggest things that we can do to override that is to work with the synchronicity of our genes, synchronicity with our cells, our periphery, and our brain. And what that means is our brain has sort of a circadian clock. Okay, it's regulated by what's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So our brain understands the 24-hour cycle. Our periphery, our peripheral cells understand a 24-hour cycle, but they are operating in different rooms and they don't necessarily communicate with each other. Well, they do, but we need them to communicate with each other. We need to make sure that that door is open. If the door is closed and you have one set that's asleep during the day and one set that's awake during the day, that's not synchronicity. Okay, we need the brain and the tissues to be in harmony. Being able to synchronize this comes down to understanding when melatonin is increased and when cortisol is increased. And we come from this school of thought that cortisol should never be spiked. Cortisol absolutely should be spiked at certain times. It should ultimately be elevated shortly after you wake up in the morning, and its peak shortly after you wake up in the morning. If you look at the image that's on the screen right now, you'll see a very simple image that shows that. Okay, melatonin is increasing at night, then it comes down, and we have an increase in cortisol where it's peaking shortly after daylight starts, and then that comes down as the day goes on and melatonin starts to come up again. It's pretty simple. Some of the quickest ways that we can manipulate that, and one of the most powerful ways that we can manipulate that, is not through food, not necessarily through food timing, but it really is through light. And I'm not a total expert here, but I understand the basic fundamentals, and I've been able to use it personally to my advantage. There's a study that was published in the journal Physiology of Behavior that looked at this. They found that people that were simply exposed to brighter light in general, between 9 a.m. and 9 p.m., ended up having improved levels of melatonin. If they were exposed to only dim light between 9 a.m. and 9 p.m., they had suppressed levels of melatonin. So literally, the simple light exposure that we're just accustomed to is going to make a big difference. Arguably, sunlight being the best. Of course, we don't want to just sit under fluorescent lights all the time. But then there's some more data that suggests that early morning sunlight is the best possible. Okay? And it's not because you're trying to encourage your body to wake up with the sun. In some ways, that makes sense from a biological perspective, but it's really about just those cues. You're not triggering the body, hey, be awake. You're triggering the body to just develop a rhythm. Think of it like that. Because I don't want you to think, oh, if I go and get sunlight at 6 a.m., my body's gonna wake up at 5:45 a.m. every single day. That's not what we're after. We're after the body having natural hormonal and catecholamine changes to happen during those times. And if you can't get up early enough to go get sunlight, bright sunlight for 10 or 15 minutes shortly after you wake up, invest in a little red light therapy and do that. Arguably, one of the better ways to expose yourself to the right light in a really kind of nuancy fashion to get the right time. So that's something that you can do really powerfully. Another thing we have to remember here with light is that there was a study that demonstrated that when you are not sleeping in a dark room, even when you're asleep, okay, just sleeping in a room that has a little bit of light is going to suppress melatonin by 50%. Okay, that's huge. So just by having a window that's getting a lot of moonlight can affect your sleep. So sleep in a wicked dark room as much as you can. These are the kinds of things we don't think about. We leave the lights on until it's time to go to bed, and then it's time to go to bed and we turn them off. But if we actually turn them off a little bit sooner and we let our body adjust, 99% of people literally are going to have more melatonin and sleep better. Now we move into the foods. This is where things get kind of interesting, because with foods, it is a little bit nuancy, but there is some concrete stuff. We're going to start with the most concrete and kind of work our way down. I know that I've talked about maybe avoiding milk in the past, but when you look at the observational data, there was a meta-analysis looking at 14 different studies, demonstrated that across the board, when subjects had a little bit of warm milk before bed, they slept not a little bit better, but significantly better. Now, maybe this is simply biological, maybe it's comfort. And that's probably the best really inkling that I have, because you could say there's some melatonin, there's some tryptophan in milk. I just don't think it's doing that much, but that's my personal opinion. I think there is a sort of innate comfort that comes from warm milk from when we were babies, right? It just makes sense that way. The caveat with that is if you drink milk before bed, you're probably going to have to pee. And Dr. Andy Galpin has talked about this. If you're peeing once in the middle of the night, that's okay, not great. If you're peeing twice in the middle of the night, there's something that needs to be adjusted. If you're peeing more than 2 times per night, you really need to look at something that's going on, because peeing in the middle of the night is one of the largest disruptors of sleep that's out there. So if you're going to have some warm milk, A, have it be warm, not hot. B, only do like a half a cup or so. And C, I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but maybe make it a little bit more like some raw, unpasteurized milk, so you're not getting the milk that's denatured and devoid of all the potential nutrients and myristic acid, like the good fats that are in the milk in the first place. The next one is tart cherry juice, and I've done full videos on this because tart cherry juice is phenomenal stuff. There are some studies that show that when you have tart cherry juice, you have significantly better sleep compared to placebo. In fact, there was another study that took a look at tart cherry juice and found that sleep improved by 84 total minutes. 84 total minutes more sleep. And this was measured by polysomnography. So this isn't just subjective scores. This is legitimate objective data by plugging people into machines and seeing how they sleep over a longer period of time. Okay, we're talking a quarter to a half a cup of tart cherry juice. Yes, there's carbohydrates, so if you're doing low carb, it may not work. It also might be one of those things where even if you are low carb, maybe getting a little bit of sleep is better than being low carb with no sleep. So really think about that for a minute. What's wild about tart cherry juice is it also seems to improve subjective pain scores. Now, you may not realize it, but pain can be a big reason why you're not sleeping either, right? You don't realize that you have these subtle cues of pain that are just keeping you awake. So if you're modulating inflammation and reducing subjective pain scores, then maybe you're sleeping better that route, which leads to another study that looked at tart cherry juice specifically in marathoners. Okay, so with marathon runners, it said, okay, we're gonna give you tart cherry juice for 5 days prior to your marathon. And those that had the tart cherry juice before their marathons for 5 days, they ended up having reduced levels of lactate dehydrogenase. They had reduced levels of overall inflammation, IL-6, tumor necrosis factor alpha. Their overall recovery was better and their inflammatory and immune response was less, which is a little bit more like this objective, like mechanical data that we need to understand why subjective pain scores might have gone down. It's not total proof in the pudding, but it explains, maybe inflammation is reducing and we're sleeping a little bit better as a result. Then we come into this big question of carbs before bed or not. And this is a constant fight within, I guess I should say, the online community. It's not really a fight within the scientific community. Carbs before bed are gonna help me sleep. Carbs before bed are gonna keep me awake. Well, there's a fine line, right? Okay, first of all, if you do have carbs before bed, they should be 3 or 4 hours before bed. They should not be right before bed. Okay, and we'll talk about this in a second. But there was a study published in the Western Journal of Nursing Research that really just spelled it all out. They looked at high fat diets, high carb diets, and high protein diets before bed. And they found that above all, high protein diets led to the best sleep after a few months. They just led to more sleep. Didn't matter if you had high carbs or not, it was high protein was the winner. Now the reason behind this is we say that high carbs before bed or a few hours before bed are good because they spike insulin and that therefore allows the amino acids to go into the brain, okay? That is absolutely valid and that is true, okay? But you can conquer a lot of the same thing by getting more amino acids into the brain by just having more protein and creating more amino acids to be available. So you have less amino acids that are allowed into the brain because of an insulin spike, or you just create a bunch of amino acids by eating more protein. So there's a solution for both parties, right? Those that like carbs, have your carbs at night. It will help you. Those that don't like carbs, have your protein before bed. It's going to help you. But above all else, it does not matter who you are. Eating carbohydrates inside of 3 hours before bed is not a good thing. And you might think, oh, well, I can have this spike in blood sugar and then it's gonna crash me. I'm gonna go hypoglycemic and I'll fall asleep. That is true in theory, you will fall asleep. However, think about the counter-regulatory measures that your body puts in place. Okay, then what happens when your blood sugar drops? Adrenaline spikes, cortisol spikes, and not only is this not good because it wakes you up, because of course adrenaline's gonna wake you up, but guess what we're doing? We're having opposite antagonistic hormonal responses. We're having cortisol increase when melatonin's increased, and guess what? We're screwing up that whole circadian cue that we've been working so hard for again. So it has a deeper, more ingrained problem that it could occur from it. Now, a lot of the things I'm talking about, like tart cherry juice, things like even carbohydrates that you might want to have before bed, better options. I put a link down below for Thrive Market. They're an online membership-based grocery store. They've been on this channel for a number of years. That is a 30% off discount link. So if you're doing grocery shopping, you're trying to think, where can I find tart cherry juice? Where can I find all these things that Thomas is going to talk about and talks about? That link down below is awesome. It's 30% off your entire grocery order plus a free gift up to $50. So check out that link down below. So you go online, you sort by different diet type. You can literally search for a food. It's like Amazon, but so much better because it has good real foods that are vetted out and everything's delivered to your doorstep in just a couple of days. So check that link out down below for 30% off your entire grocery order, whether it's $100 or $1,000. That link is down below in the description. A big thank you to them for allowing us to create this awesome content. Definitely recommend you check them out. Okay, from a food and supplementation side, with magnesium, one of the most vetted out sleep aids that you could have. Now I could tell you to go get 500 milligrams of magnesium from almonds, but you're gonna end up consuming thousands of calories in almonds. So this is one of those foods where I say, you might be better off using a supplement. Like dimagnesium malate is the one that I usually recommend, okay? Now, when you look at the data, 500 milligrams seems to be the gold standard. Now, 500 milligrams of magnesium published in this particular study, increase in sleep efficiency, decrease in sleep onset latency, increase in total sleep time, and increases in melatonin and decreases in cortisol. We're checking all these boxes here, okay? Now, the reasoning is interesting. Okay, there's a couple potential mechanisms here. For one, magnesium actually binds to what's called an NMDA receptor. This means it binds to a receptor in your brain. When that happens, you end up having a subsequent decrease in what's called adrenocorticotropin, which leads to a buildup of other compounds, which therefore reduce protein kinase A. When this happens, then you have less conversion of cholesterol to pregnenolone. And I know I'm going off here, but pregnenolone is the first step in cortisol manufacturing in the body. So you're essentially at the very core inception, you're attenuating, you're turning down cortisol production. So that's one potential mechanism that magnesium works upon. The other simple mechanism is that magnesium binds to a receptor on the pineal gland, which directly influences melatonin production as well. So you're working two pathways. You're relaxing, reducing cortisol, and subsequently increasing melatonin, which is quite interesting. This next one is very interesting, and it also has to do with the sunlight at the same time. It's vitamin D. Now, how we came to this conclusion was there was a study that was looking at fatty fish consumption, and they found with this study, people that were consuming salmon and fattier fish ended up having like a 10-ish% increase in their sleep scores. Like, what's going on here? And sort of reverse engineering the process, look at like, okay, maybe vitamin D is the equation here. Now, I'm personally a much bigger fan of getting vitamin D from the sun than from food or supplements, whenever possible. But I also understand it's not always real for people. So if you're going to supplement vitamin D, I think starting at like 2,000 to 5,000 IUs is probably where to go, and do it with dinner a few hours before bed, not right before bed. You want to mimic, think about how long it takes for that vitamin D to absorb, and you want it to sort of mimic as if you were getting sunlight, right? Here's what's interesting. This is somewhat of a hypothesis, but very interesting data. Okay, with vitamin D actually binds to receptors. Now we have something called tryptophan hydroxylase, which is a gene that is associated with the conversion of serotonin to melatonin, or rather tryptophan to serotonin and then serotonin to melatonin. Okay, so without this tryptophan hydroxylase gene, this conversion can't happen, which means we can't take the amino acid from protein, that tryptophan, and convert it into serotonin and ultimately into melatonin. Well, what does vitamin D have to do with this? What we're starting to see in the data is that vitamin D binds to a vitamin D receptor that is literally on the gene for tryptophan hydroxylase. And when vitamin D binds to this gene, it triggers more expression of this gene. So it creates more of this gene. It's like, we have a built-in biological incentive to get sunlight. And we have a built-in biological equation that the more sunlight we get, vitamin D, the more ability to sleep we have. It makes sense because the body says, oh, if you're out in the sun more, you're probably more active. So we need to make sure we encourage sleep for rest and recovery and rejuvenation. Who would have ever thought, right? So the more that we can express these genes, the better we can ultimately convert our protein into these usable sources for melatonin and sleep. Now let's get into the bad stuff. Caffeine probably goes without saying, but I bet you didn't know that even caffeine 6 hours before bed screws you up almost as much as having it 3 hours or even 0 hours before bed. There's a study that looked at that. Caffeine 0, 3, and 6 hours before bed, and they found, guess what? 6 hours before bed wasn't a whole lot different than 3 hours, and 3 hours wasn't a heck of a lot different from 0 hours. Just because it's not amping you up doesn't mean that it's not affecting your sleep, okay? When you are occupying this adenosine receptor, it's affecting drowsiness, and that drowsiness could be affected to not allowing you to get into this deep sleep. So cut out the caffeine like 8 hours before bed. It should go without saying. Next one is interesting, spicy foods. Spicy foods have an adrenaline-like effect on the body, and there are some larger cohort studies that looked at this. It's on like college students that were consuming high amounts of spicy food when they were like staying up late cramming for tests and stuff. That affected their sleep. So we start looking at the data and say, oh, it has to do with the adrenaline response. Once again, spicy food does have that impact. Not to mention the subtle pain cues that you might get from the gastrointestinal tract when you wake up and you don't realize it because you have hot pipes in the middle of the night. And yeah, it doesn't exactly feel good. Anyway, moving on, alcohol is another one. I don't need to dive into a lot of detail there. Alcohol may knock you out, but I can promise you, you're not getting the sleep that you want. And then we come back to the refined starches again. Okay, if you're going to have refined starches or sugar, you gotta have it 3 hours before bed. That's just the rule. Okay, and again, you might get by one night doing it, but if you start making it a habit, that's when you start running into the problems. Okay, now we need to jump into the timing for just a moment. With timing, things are intriguing because we have talked about intermittent fasting on this channel a lot as a huge benefiting factor or technique or lifestyle technique for sleep. And a lot of that comes from the fact that A, someone's losing weight, B, inflammatory modulation is improved, like you're decreasing inflammation. But I think really the big one is people lose weight, right? When they start losing weight, they're going to sleep better. And you look at like the case of sleep apnea, for instance. If you lose weight and you lose 1 pound of fat on your chest, that's 1 pound less pressure putting down on your chest when you're breathing, when you're sleeping, trying to breathe, trying to get good, deep, diaphragmatic, relaxed breaths. So I don't want to put the cart before the horse and say that intermittent fasting is magic for sleep. But what's interesting is that when you look at early time restricted feeding where you intermittent fast and then don't eat in the afternoon, evening, we see a big pivot towards being able to sleep better there. And that's interesting because there was a study published in the Journal of Sleep Research that looked at Ramadan. And it found when people going through Ramadan fasting, they're eating between the hours of like roughly 6 p.m. and 10:30 p.m. They're eating late, like late time restricted feeding, late intermittent fasting. Their sleep scores went to garbage. They had decreases in slow wave sleep and decreases in REM sleep that were not just small amounts, significant amounts. And this was also measured via polysomnography. It wasn't subjective. It was objective. In fact, the subjective scores were kind of interesting. People a lot of times think they're sleeping better because they're eating a lot of food before bed and they're tired and they're going to bed. Nope, it was affecting things negatively. And then when we talk about sleep apnea, there was a study published in Clinical Nutrition and ESPEN. This was interesting because it took a look at subjects with sleep apnea and it found that there was a very powerfully strong correlation between caloric intake, the amount of calories they consumed in the evening, and their occurrence of sleep apnea and their ability to sleep. This is interesting. So does this mean that intermittent fasting is bad? I think if intermittent fasting is successful for you in terms of losing weight, it's a good thing, but we still need to consolidate our calories. Even if we're eating later in the day, we need to consolidate them as early to our eating period as possible. So if you break your fast at 3 p.m., you should have a largest meal shortly thereafter and taper as the day goes on, and don't try to do the opposite where you're trying to increase calories as the day goes on. Now, a few really quick things that you can apply that is just lifestyle oriented. For one, hot baths before bed. This is going to allow you to be able to kind of vasodilate, and it cools the core when you get out. This natural thermoregulation triggers melatonin production. And studies demonstrate that a hot bath, if you just immerse yourself up to your neck, works almost as well as a sauna. So I don't want to hear the fact that you can't afford a sauna. You can still do this kind of stuff, and you don't need to do it every night, but you can do it to get yourself into the habit of it. Making your room super dark. This is another big one, okay? I talked about that before. But routine, okay? No matter what your routine, make it routine. Okay, have your vitamins set out, have your toothbrush set out. It makes a big difference as far as how the brain works and being able to relax and get into this routine. And then lastly, one of the things, and I hope you haven't turned off this video because this is one that's helped me immensely, we don't realize, especially if you carry muscle. Okay, muscle weighs more than fat, right? So if I have the amount of muscle that I have on my chest, and you put me next to someone that is morbidly obese and maybe 280 pounds or so, and they don't have much muscle, but they have a lot of fat, there's a good chance that I have just as much weight on my chest as that person has on their chest. Okay, that person probably has sleep apnea and probably has to be on a CPAP. But I'm fit, I'm young, I'm lean, I'm muscular. I don't need to be on a CPAP, right? Except the actual weight of my chest is actually equating to a similar amount of weight that's on his chest. So this is for the younger athletic or even older and athletic people that don't think they might suffer from sleep apnea. Now the other thing is you have to remember, if you train a lot and you have tight traps, you have a tight back, all this stuff, that restricts and constricts your breathing. And you can't get these big diaphragmatic breaths. So something that I've learned it from Dr. Peter Attia, is doing dead hangs. Just hanging from a bar for 30 seconds, 60 seconds, work your way up. Sometimes I even use wrist wraps so that I can hang and not have to worry about my grip, because what happens with that is you'll notice you get this deep diaphragmatic breath, and eventually it becomes habit. Because the way that we breathe, nasal breathing, big deep breaths, even nasal exhalation, triggers that parasympathetic nervous system, and it forces you to relax. Next thing you know, your back is more relaxed. You make this a habit and doing it a couple hours or even an hour before bed, and it's a huge difference in terms of training your body to get good diaphragmatic breaths. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I hope this video served as a complete guide, and I'll see you tomorrow.